Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone today? I can see people joining. I'm just going to give it 5 seconds, guys, okay, if you don't mind. People are just logging in slightly, probably enjoying the sun as we speak. Hi, Sean, how are you?
Good, Tony, thank you. Good.
You've sun. You're in the Dublin side. Is there sun today? There is?
I'm in the Wexford side, thankfully.
The Wexford side.
The sunny southeast, living up to its name for once.
That's it. Thanks, guys. Listen, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this series of webinars. This is our first Lunch and Learn series of 2022, which is great. Today we're looking at the contract expenses side and how to claim on the contract expenses side, which you're all interested in. And I'm delighted to welcome Sean Piggott. We're conducting these webinars in 2022 in association with ICON, and we're delighted that Sean, who's head of business development for ICON, and we'll speak today on the contracting expenses side. Thanks, Sean.
Not at all. Delighted to be here. Thanks for having me. Just
before we start, and you're probably all interested, and hopefully you all have questions for Sean and myself. But just before we start, it's going to be a live webinar, guys. So we're going to kick off, and Sean is going to give a presentation slightly, and I'll do Sean again. But just if you have any questions, there's a Q&A section you might see on the website there. If you click into the Q&A side and pop in your question, Sean and I will address any questions at the end, okay? So I'll be your host for today. Looking at the audience, I think some of you or most of you will know me. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the current operations director of the Berkeley Group, and I would manage the operations on our 3 core verticals, which is life science and engineering, business technology, and supply chain and procurement. Feel free to ask me any questions at the end. And I'll point you to our website as well. If you want to connect with any of our consultants, feel free to see the team on our website and feel free to connect from there. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome Sean. Thanks again, Sean.
Not at all. Not at all. Delighted to be here. I'm going to start, I suppose, guys, by sharing my screen straight away. And again, as Tony touched on, the idea of today is hopefully that we will uncover a couple of expenses that people are unaware of, or even, I suppose, attract people to contracting that haven't contracted before. So hopefully you guys can see my screen now. Again, I suppose just in case there is any kind of follow-up queries or anything after the call, obviously you can reach out to the team at the team at Berkeley there, or Tony directly. Likewise, my own details are on the screen, and we'll make sure that they're shared afterwards, just in case there is any, I suppose, follow-up queries. But again, I suppose what we'll do just to get started is have a quick look at the agenda as to what we're going to look at today. So first and foremost, we're going to look at what a business expense is. So what defines a business expense? Then we're going to look at the different kind of stages of your contract role, where you can obviously experience the business expenses, or where you're most likely to come across the different types of expenses. Expenses throughout the contract opportunity, so expenses starting and expenses throughout, and then other expenses to take advantage of. And hopefully, like I say, we'll uncover a couple of gems in there for our attendees. We're then also going to have a look at the impact of claiming expenses on your payslip. So we've got a couple of examples done out there that will hopefully, again, I suppose, signify how important it is to take advantage of the tax relief available. And then we'll have a quick look at a summary and summarize all before we get on to, as Tony touched on, the questions. So again, any questions throughout, feel free to obviously populate the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And as Tony touched on, we'll make sure that we cover off as many as we physically can at the end. So what is a business expense? As per revenue, a business expense is essentially an expense that's wholly and exclusively essentially for the purpose of your trade. So what that technically means, or I suppose to take the technicality away from it, is it's an expense that you shouldn't really experience unless you're actually contracting. So it's an expense that's directly correlated with your role. Again, there's a wide array of different expenses that you can come up against, and we're going to touch on them in a little bit more detail. But first and foremost, that's essentially revenue's definition of what is a business expense. And obviously it's important to touch on the fact that it's revenue essentially that set out them guidelines. It's not a case that your accountant is trying to be difficult with you if they're pushing back on an expense that you're trying to claim. It's more so a case that obviously it's not allowable from revenue standpoint, and therefore obviously we have to follow the revenue guidelines. So the first one I'm going to touch on, and again, it's very important when I suppose you're considering starting a new contract role, or if it's a case that I suppose you are looking at relocating as a result of a contract role. It's one that's often forgotten, to be 100% honest, but relocation expenses is a massive, massive benefit to anyone that is currently operating as an independent professional. It's, again, like I say, it's one of the most fruitful expenses that can be claimed. And the reason being for that is, again, I suppose, first and foremost, you can cover, I suppose, your initial travel to the new location. So whether that's A flight, if you're coming to Ireland for a contract opportunity, if you're relocating to Ireland, it doesn't necessarily have to be a case where you're internationally relocating. Again, there is a minimum distance that does apply. So the 100 kilometers has to apply in order to be applicable to this type of an expense. But as well as that, if you are, again, relocating, whether it be 101 kilometers or 1,000 kilometers, you can essentially accommodation expenses of 10 nights. So the subsistence rate for the accommodation expenses is €147 per night. And what that gives, I suppose, contractors and independent professionals the opportunity to do is to arrange living arrangements. So if they haven't already kind of, I suppose, figured out where they're going to be staying throughout their contract role, it gives them an opportunity to do so, and hopefully takes away a little bit of the pressure associated with obviously finding the travel or finding the accommodation, apologies. As well as that, then on top of your 10-night stay in terms of your subsistence at the hotel or B&B, whatever the case may be, you can also claim up to 3 months rental accommodation, which is absolutely massive. So again, obviously the price of rent is sky high everywhere across the country. So again, the fact that you can turn around and process your 3 months rental accommodation as a business expense makes a massive difference on your payslip. And again, we're going to touch on the impact that it can have on your payslip towards the end of the slideshow. One thing to keep in mind when you are, I suppose, trying to process a rental accommodation expense is that you will require either a copy of the lease agreement or at the very minimum, the PPS number from your landlord. So just keep that in mind. And again, I suppose it's worthwhile keeping again in mind essentially that it's not just yourself that you can obviously expense in terms of traveling and getting there. It's also the likes of your removal, your storage, and actually the cost of transferring the goods to the new location. So whether it's a removal van, whether it's storing the actual goods, if you're moving out of one place and I suppose waiting to get into your other place whilst you're in your 10 nights hotel stay, there's an awful lot of expenses that can be claimed. So definitely take advantage of them. And the other point to touch on as well, just before we move on to the next point, is if you're married, if you're in a civil partnership, or if you've got family members relocating with you, so if you've got children, they can also, obviously, the cost of relocating your family is also considered a business expense. So massive benefit in terms of taking advantage of it, and definitely something that we would always see and advise on in terms of our independent professionals that are relocating for a contract role. Biggest takeaway from this slide, to be 100% honest, is that 100 kilometers, obviously, guideline that's set out from revenues perspective. I suppose moving on then, apart from the actual physically getting to your new contract location, there's also obviously the other side of things. Well, what are you going to need to bring with you? If it's a case that you need to bring new equipment to your contract role, or if you're going to need new equipment as a result of your contract opportunity, you can claim business equipment as an expense. So examples of business equipment can be anything from a phone, a laptop. It can be a desk or a chair, obviously, which is something that obviously we all kind of had to familiarize ourselves with if people weren't, I suppose, set up with a home office. I know myself personally, I definitely wasn't, but it's a case where you can obviously go and get your desk, get your chair, and other home office equipment that's required essentially to carry out your role is also considered a business expense. So I'd again take advantage of it wherever possible. If your role is even hybrid, there's also that flexibility to make sure that you can obviously claim them expenses. One point to make, I suppose, and especially it's important on this slide because again, I know that a lot of independent professionals in roles such as the technology sector, they're going to need high performing laptops. They're going to need, obviously, whether it's a phone, it's typically not going to be less than €250. So it's definitely worthwhile noting that any significant expense, whether it be, I suppose, from a equipment standpoint or I suppose wider, whether it be a desk, whatever it may be, anything that needs, that's considered significant. So that's over a value of €250 should always be in the company name. So whether that's an umbrella company or your own personal limited company, make sure your receipt or your invoice or whatever it may be is made out to your company name. Again, I suppose we'll move on in terms of, I suppose, going out throughout the life cycle of your contract and your contract opportunity. What other expenses could you come across, or what other expenses are you likely to come across? One of the biggest ones is obviously, and again, it's quite relevant in terms of what we've experienced in the last 2 years, is the working from home expenses. So many independent professionals, as you know, will perform duties whilst working from home. Again, there's more of a hybrid model, I suppose, kind of on a widespread basis now. There is, I suppose, a push on getting people back to the office. So we'll also discuss return to the office expenses, which can also be claimed. But again, common examples of a working from home expense. Mobile phone usage is a big one. So again, if it's a case that you use the same mobile phone for both personal and, I suppose, professional use, approximately 50% of the bill can be claimed as a business expense. If you have a completely separate phone for business, then it's a different scenario. It's a different conversation, obviously, with your accountant, and 100% of the separate professional phone can be expensed as a business expense. The other one to look at is obviously the electricity and internet. Similarly, if it's a case where you've got a premises that's specifically for, I suppose, carrying out your role, again, it's a different conversation. But from a working from home standpoint, you're looking at, again, about approximately 50% of the usage. So if your bill is €300, €150 essentially is what you'd be looking at in terms of a business expense. There's an interesting point to touch on, obviously, and I know the e-workers allowance is something that was obviously kind of rejuvenated and reintroduced to us all. It's €3.20 per day. So again, it can equate to quite a lot if you take into account if you're working from home 20 days a week, it all does add up, or sorry, 20 days a month, apologies. It all does add up. So it's definitely worthwhile taking advantage of if you haven't already done so. The one thing to touch on again is it's an or rather than an and, unfortunately. So it's not a case where you can claim your $3.20 per day and then also claim 50% of your usage. In some cases, depending on each individual scenario and I suppose the requirements of the role, there may be, I suppose, some room to claim some of the bills. So it won't be 50%, but it may be, I suppose, some wiggle room there to try and claim a little bit more off the expense if required. The other one that's very, very popular is professional subscription expenses. And obviously, as an independent professional, there is that mindset that you're constantly evolving, you're constantly adding new skills, and you're constantly trying to add to the expertise that you have essentially on offer as operating as your own brand, essentially. So often professional subscriptions are required, obviously, in order to carry out the role. It may be a case that you're looking at the likes of whether it be an Adobe profile, whether it be an ACCA qualification or professional membership, essentially. It will vary from role to role, so keep that in mind, obviously, and it can, again, it has to be drawn back to the fact that it has to be in relation to your contract role. It doesn't necessarily directly have to be exactly a course that's recommended, but it does have to relate to your contract opportunity or to the role that you're carrying out at that time. So again, something to keep in mind. Like I said, the software subscriptions such as Adobe, and as well as that, I know it's not very common anymore, but you can also claim the likes of textbooks or any kind of, I suppose, professional literature as well if they are required. Moving along then into the mileage and subsistence, it's probably one of the most common questions we get, to be honest, when we represent our independent professionals. Again, it's something that's constantly being reviewed by revenue, to be 100% honest. The biggest thing to keep in mind, I suppose, with this one is this is an area where revenue are particularly stringent. So even if it is a case where you're operating under your own personal limited company and you're managing your own finances, that's absolutely fine, but it's definitely worthwhile essentially making sure that you are following the guidelines. So independent professionals may be entitled to claim mileage and subsistence in certain circumstances. However, the travel should not be to and from the nominal place of work. So what that essentially means is your travel to the site or the office or wherever you carry out your role, that travel, unfortunately, or that mileage cannot be claimed back. However, mileage can be claimed essentially if you're traveling away from your typical normal place of work. So if it's a case that your typical place of work, you're working there 3 days a week, you're working from home 2 days a week, your travel to and from obviously the site where you're working for 3 days is not allowed. However, if there's an off-site training day, if there's a conference on essentially that you have to attend and that's away from the nominal place of work, your mileage to and from is absolutely allowable and definitely should be taken advantage of. So again, off-site meetings and trainings, if you're meeting clients away from, again, the nominal place of work, definitely take advantage of it. And again, there's also a blog, I suppose, that we've done in relation to kind of what them rates are. The rates for mileage and subsistence, just before we move on to the next piece in terms of upskilling and training, the rates essentially are dependent on your engine capacity in your vehicle. So again, you can find them on the revenue website. You can also find them on the Icon Account website, and I'll make sure that we get them across to the team at Berkeley so they can share them details with you afterwards as well. From an upskilling and training perspective, I touched on it in the last slide. It's common knowledge essentially that as a contractor and as an independent professional, if you're trying to make the most of operating as an independent professional, or if your goal is to operate as an independent professional for as long as possible, there's that many obviously changing and moving parts. I suppose your qualifications would never be finished. You'll never be fully qualified. It's a case where you're constantly trying to develop your skill set. You're constantly trying to add to the expertise that you have. And obviously you're trying to attract more clients or more, I suppose, skills, like I say. So again, whether that is a case where you're looking at courses, certificates, or any other upskilling costs can be claimed. So whether it's a case that you are in Java development, for example, if there's another kind of add-on that you can take for that, or if you're in Python or whatever it may be, project management, as long as the project or the course or your certificate is in line with your actual contract, again, there'll be no issue with regards to claiming that as a business expense. Unfortunately, non-work related qualifications aren't eligible for reimbursement. So again, keep that in mind before you go off and sign up to Spanish grinds or whatever the case may be, unless obviously you've got a Spanish opportunity on the horizon. Some other examples of, I suppose, expenses that you should definitely try to take advantage of. Again, these are the kind of most common ones that we see when traditionally, I suppose, there's plenty of independent professionals out there, obviously, that wouldn't be with a dedicated contractor's accountant. And these are the expenses that they tend to miss out on because, again, it's a case where, I suppose, their accounts are done. I'm not saying that it's a case where they're not being looked after from a financial and a compliance perspective, but it's just that insight into making sure that you take advantage of all of these different things. Sorry, I think I've just lost the screen there slightly. But the small benefit exemption scheme is more than likely, I suppose, the most popular, like I say, that you won't have heard of, or again, if you have heard of it, keep taking advantage of it. What it is essentially is an opportunity for you to expense a €500 gift voucher once a year. So there was a couple of changes on it a couple of years ago, essentially, that allowed you to take one voucher for €250, let's say, at the start of the year and another one at the end of the year. It has to be a once-off purchase now. So a €500 voucher doesn't necessarily have to be from any particular supplier. It doesn't necessarily have to be in relation to your actual contract role. And again, the main thing is to keep that expense essentially in the business name. Again, the full €500 must be spent on a single purchase. Make sure it's in the company name. And that's all you need to know about the small benefit exemption scheme, to be honest. If you haven't got a dedicated point of contact in your accountancy firm or whoever's looking after your finances at this moment in time, make sure to set yourself a reminder in your calendar, set it up as an annual reminder. And again, it's the case that, like I say, as long as the expense is made out to the actual company name, you can fire away and get your €500 voucher once a year. Another massive one that all of our, I suppose, clients are advised to take advantage of, to be honest, is the pension contributions and the income protection. And the reason being, I suppose, there's an awful lot of independent professionals in the Irish market operate as a director. And what that means is that you are now essentially making contributions to the Class S PRSI contribution, and it doesn't cover the illness benefit. So although the illness benefit will cover you for €203 per week, if you're operating as a director of an umbrella company or of your own personal limited company, making Class S PRSI contributions does not cover your illness benefit. So income protection is a great way to alleviate that concern should the worst case scenario ever arise. And it means that you're safeguarding up to 75% of your income. So not only is it tax efficient to take advantage of it, it also increases, I suppose, the amount of income that you can earn should, I say, like the worst case scenario arise. Again, it's one of the most popular expenses that we I suppose, process on a monthly basis and on a weekly basis in some cases. And again, if you're a company director, you'll also be able to qualify for an executive pension. So the difference between a standard PRSA pension and an executive pension is there's further tax relief on offer essentially to a director of a company. And it just means that you're essentially safeguarding more of your income for the future rather than obviously giving it to the taxman. So definitely something to take advantage of if you're not already taking advantage of it is the executive pension contribution. Again, like I've touched on, income protection is another good way to safeguard your income to a certain threshold should you become ill or unable to work. So like I said, the worst case scenario, you want to be prepared for that. Again, hopefully it won't happen to any of our attendees or any independent professionals, but again, on a percentage basis, it's more than likely going to happen. So it's a great way to, like I say, reduce your tax liability and at the same time, make sure that you're covered in the worst case scenario should that event arise. Just to give you an example, I suppose, in a graph form as well, if you have a pension contribution, as you can see on the left-hand side of the table, there's no pension contribution. On the right-hand side, there is a pension contribution. And you can see straight away, essentially with the €1,000 pension contribution, it's actually only costing you less than €500. And that's with the 52% tax relief available on a director's executive pension. Again, a PRSA pension will give you tax relief, but it won't give you the same level of tax relief. It's about 40% in terms of a standard pension. If you're a director of a company, whether it be a personal limited company or a director umbrella company, you can get up to 52% tax relief on executive pension contributions. And that really shows, I suppose, are you better off with the €500, or sorry, are you better off with the €1,000 in your pension pot than obviously giving the extra €500 to the revenue? So again, definitely something to take advantage of. Another one that's coming up, and it's, I suppose, becoming more common in the last couple of weeks as, I suppose, companies start to try and get people back to the office, even if it is on a hybrid model, is the tax saver ticket. And the tax saver ticket essentially is an incentive for workers to use public transport. What it means is you can use any of the public transport methods. So if you're based in Dublin, obviously you've got a few more options than you would certainly in Wexford anyway. But again, it means that whether it be by bus, by rail, or even by Lewis, you can essentially expense the cost of the ticket. And the whole idea of that is to incentivize people to use the public transport wherever possible. There are different types of monthly and annual tickets available. And again, if you get in touch with, I suppose, your accountant. If it's with Icon Accountant, again, your account manager will be able to help you. If it's another accountant out there as well, just ask the question and they'll be more than happy to assist and advise on, I suppose, what ticket you should be trying to aim for based on the travel. Another one, if you're quite close, obviously, to your place of work, is the Bike to Work scheme. Again, it was absolutely massively popular when it first came out. It hasn't been as popular in the last couple of years. And I assume, I suppose the reason for that is because people have already taken advantage of it and they're waiting for their cycle to end now again. Excuse the pun with regards to cycle. But the reason I say that is because you can obviously claim it more than once. It's not just a case where it's a once-off thing. It's every 4 years, essentially, you can claim your Bike to Work scheme. So the Bike to Work scheme, what it is for anyone that doesn't know about it, is it's basically an incentive, again, to encourage workers to cycle to work, and the cost will be a taxable benefit in kind. The limit for traditional pedal bikes, including your safety equipment, was €1,000, but it's now been increased to $1,250. And again, for e-bikes and I suppose related safety equipment for your e-bike, the limit is €1,500. So definitely something to keep in mind if you are traveling by bicycle, essentially, to your place of work. The scheme can be utilized, like I said, once every 4 years. So once you've kind of fulfilled your 4 years, you can go and buy a new bike. You can even upgrade to an e-bike, because there's plenty more of them around now as well. So what we're going to do now is have a quick look as to what kind of an impact it can have on your payslip. So I've used the same example essentially throughout the 3 next slides. And again, the daily rate, I suppose, that we have selected here is €350 per day. There's no expenses applied outside of the management fee on this payslip. So straight away, I'm going to try and point you towards, I suppose, the most important part of the actual payslip where you can see this. So you can see the payments here is 20 days, €350. It leaves you with a gross payment of €7,000 before your taxes are deducted. Allowable expenses in this case is set to 0. And I suppose the next main point to take away from this slide is that your payment, your net payment after your taxes have been deducted, is €4,453.13. What we're now going to do is have a look at the same exact independent professional, but in this case, or in the next case, I should say, they've actually they've claimed some allowable expenses, which will have an impact on their payslip. So again, I'll just ask you to keep that figure in mind, 4,453 with no expenses. When we claim business expenses, so we've also claimed €300 expenses, that could be whether it is essentially the likes of your tax saver ticket, that could be whether it's a new desk or a new chair for your home office, whatever the scenario may be. The €300 reimbursable expenses will now appear here, essentially. So you can see that your tax is definitely going to have an impact. And as a result of that, your 52% tax relief that you've applied for means that you're going to come out with more money in your pocket at the end of the day, which is obviously what we're all trying to achieve. So again, we've got one more example of this after, I suppose, this slide, and it's going to show you a pension contribution as well, because to me, a pension contribution is an absolute no-brainer. Again, everyone has their own opinions on it, and look, not trying to influence or encourage anyone to do anything that they're not comfortable with. But in my eyes, the way I look at a pension contribution is it better off in my future pocket in terms of my pension, or is it better off in revenue's pocket where it's going to go if you don't use it, essentially? So I'm going to go on to the next slide. Again, you can see there's an increase of about €150 roughly, just over €150 in terms of the net pay that you receive as a result of processing €300 business expenses. And then finally, we're going to take the example of the same expenses. So the same €300 expenses are going to be applied, but we're also going to provide a contribution of €400 now to an executive pension contribution. So you can see that the net pay has dropped slightly, not too much below, I suppose, what it was in regards to no expenses applied and no pension contribution. But what you also have to keep in mind here is you've now got €400 essentially in a pot elsewhere that's going to benefit you, hopefully, obviously, in your future, again, depending on how close you are to your pension age. Again, you've got your same €300 expenses, but it's definitely something to take advantage of, definitely something to kind of consider strongly if it's a case that you're an independent professional. Like I say, you get the extra extra relief, which is 52% rather than the standard 40% with a pension. And it means that you're going to come out with very little less than what you would have if you had no expenses. So I think it's about €35 on the difference. And as a result of that €35 less that you're taking as a net payment, you've got €400 in your pension pot for later down the line. Just to kind of, I suppose, just before we do finish up, we obviously do come across an awful lot of expenses and an awful lot of expense requests. Like I touched on at the very start of the presentation, it's not a case that your accountant is just not trying to entertain you or is trying to be difficult. It is a case that revenue guidelines obviously set out what business expenses are allowable, and business expenses that are not allowable. So to try and, I suppose, give you a little bit of insight into some of the more inappropriate, if you like, expenses that we have come across in our time. We do receive odd requests, like I say. Holidays is one of them. Entertainment purposes. So a lot of people will turn around and say, oh yeah, but I'm meeting a client and we're going out to dinner and a nightclub and coppers or wherever it may be. Unfortunately, it's not a business expense. It can't be claimed as a business expense, even if the agenda behind going out for the meal was essentially to try and obviously win new business. You have to keep that in mind. The other one is TVs. Very common around Christmas time. We've seen Valentine's Day gifts. Golf is a massive one. People try to claim their golf membership because I understand that an awful lot of business happens on the golf course, but unfortunately revenue don't recognize it the same way as I do. There's also a couple of very personal subscriptions. And as well as that, another couple is home improvements, extensions, and a garden office build. Now, that was a kind of, I suppose, it was definitely a discussion that, again, probably should have been raised with revenue. And in my opinion, I think revenue probably should have done a little bit more based on the whole, I suppose, working from home pandemic that we went through. Unfortunately, the way the revenue guidelines are set out, you can, like I say, kind of kit out your home office, but it's not a case where you can go and actually fund the build of a home office in your back garden or a garden shed or whatever the case may be. That cannot be basically processed as a business expense. And I suppose there is a lot of reasons as to why. One of the main ones that I'll touch on very, very briefly is if you were to ever sell the property, that I suppose there'd be a separate calculation as to, well, technically the home office in the back garden is not owned by you as an individual, it's owned by the company. So like I say to you, you can't actually expense the cost of building it. You can cost the expense of, like I say, kitting it out, whether that be with paint or whether it be with the likes of your desk or your chair, your computer screens, whatever else can, I suppose, go into the actual home office can be expensed, but the actual physical build cannot be expensed. Again, Christmas gifts for the kids, husband, wife, whoever it may be. Very, very obvious from a revenue perspective. They're very, very strict on it. And again, something that I would completely avoid at all costs if you can. So I suppose just to kind of summarize, my top 3 tips essentially to keep in mind when you are first and foremost kind of considering a business expense or concerned about what business expenses may be allowable. The first one is, if you're ever unsure, reach out. Reach out before asking, reach out before taking on that expense essentially. And again, whether it's with ourselves, whether it's with your own personal accountant, whether it's a family friend that's looking after your books, it never harms you to reach out before taking on the expense and to be sure essentially before, obviously, like I say, committing to buying something before you can, I suppose, be told that it's actually not an allowable expense. Remember to get the purchase in the company name is the other one that I'd touch on. Again, if you're buying stationery, whether it be, something small, not necessarily required from a business name perspective, but anything over €250 as a rule of thumb should always be in the company name, because again, they're the expenses that revenue will pay the most attention to. And then finally, I would also advise, and I suppose, to take advantage of any of the tax efficiencies that are available to you. So whether that be the small benefit exemption scheme, again, once you miss it, you can't go back and claim it for years gone by. So you have to take advantage of it within the year. So set your calendar reminder. Alternatively as well, and just to touch on the income protection piece, if it's a case where, again, none of us obviously foresee them things happening, none of us want them things to happen to us, where we find ourselves in a place where we're unable or ill essentially and cannot attend work. As an independent professional, it's really important, obviously, to safeguard yourself. So like I said, the illness benefit is not contributed to as a result of being a director of a company. The Class S PRSI contribution doesn't cover that. However, the income protection policy is a tax deductible expense. And as well as that, it can safeguard up to 75% of your income rather than just the €203 per week that's on offer from the government. The other one, obviously, is the pension. And we touched on the pension in, I suppose, a couple of slides ago. Again, my interpretation of the pension contribution is it better off in my pocket, or my future pocket, I should say, or is it better off in Revenue's bank account? So definitely 3 tips to take away with you today. And hopefully I can see we've got a couple of questions as well, Tony. Like I said before, and before we started, again, if anyone does have any, I suppose, more kind of unique scenarios, feel free to reach out to myself directly. You can get me on Sean@iconaccountant.ie, and I know obviously you can reach out to the guys at Berkeley and they'll be more than happy to assist you wherever possible as well. So again,
great, Sean, yeah,
much appreciated.
Very, very enlightening, great detail there in terms of, in particular, interest in the payslips, in terms of the net increase.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, a good few questions coming in from the attendees, which is good to see. Just going to start on the QA side. Sean, you saw it coming through. Just from Edwin, if you have a separate office, not in your home, And can mileage be claimed between that separate office and the office of the client as such?
So again, I suppose it would depend, Edwin, on your actual nominal place of work, and that's what it all comes back to. So if you are, again, traveling to your office kind of on a pattern basis, or you're working from the separate office away from your home 3 days a week, that would be considered your nominal place of work, and therefore the mileage to and from wouldn't be an allowable expense. But on the other side of that, I would say that if it's a case, for example, where you are renting an office space to conduct your contract role, essentially separate to your client, that rent could be, I suppose, considered a business expense. So there's a different angle to look at there, but unfortunately, the way revenue would recognise it is that that's your nominal place to work, and as a result, the mileage to and from that place would not be an allowable expense.
Right, and just on the 500 voucher side, is that one per company or one for each person as receiving salary from the company?
It would be, again, depending on, again, what scenario you're set up in, but it's a case where you can claim more than one per company if there's more than one person operating as a contractor through that company. If there's one person essentially paying payroll through that company, for example, that's the rule of thumb I would use. So if you're processing payroll through a company, there could be 2 or 3 contractors using the one private limited company, which is absolutely fine. Then in that scenario, you'd be entitled to the 2 or 3 small benefit exemption schemes, not just one per company. So again, if there's a payroll coming out for you, that means you're entitled to the small benefit exemption scheme.
Yeah, good question for me, and quite topical for us, Sean, as well at the moment. You know, are there any incentives towards moving towards electric cars versus the petrol diesel?
Absolutely,
potentially.
Absolutely. Again, I suppose one of the biggest things to touch on here is, I know some of our attendees are more than likely operating through their own private limited company or personal limited company, as we call them. In that scenario, there's absolutely benefits, essentially. Unfortunately, under an umbrella solution, purchasing a company vehicle is not something you can do. But from a private limited company perspective, or if you're operating under your own personal limited company, absolutely, it's something I consider. We've actually got a video on our YouTube channel as well. I'm not trying to plug myself here, Tony, but it does explain it very, very well. There's a couple of different ways as to how that expense can be claimed. And again, I suppose I can send that link across afterwards, but definitely something worth taking advantage of. I know the BIK is starting to increase slowly. It was very, very beneficial a couple of years ago. The BIK for electric vehicles was set at 0%. In the last budget, that was changed, but still definitely something that I would still consider worthy of taking advantage of wherever possible.
Great, and just addition to that for me, and working from home, what about increasing on the BER rating side, should I say, sorry, in your office home? Any partial or potential offset there?
I would say so. Yes, I'd be confident in saying that, again, if it's a case that you're looking to increase the BER rating, so whether it's a case that you're looking to add, I don't know, whether it be again, solar panels are probably a different conversation, and I'd advise you to reach out on an individual basis, essentially, to your accountant on that, depending on your own personal circumstances. But if it's a case that you're kind of insulating inside, that's fine. If it's a case that you're trying to warm the place up with heaters or storage heaters, again, that shouldn't be an issue whatsoever. Great,
yeah, good advice. Just coming through from Thomas, can subsistence, i.e. food and drink, be expensed? I know you touched upon it there, regardless of whether it's purchased at the nominal place of work, you know, so if you're offsite as such.
It can, and it's a good question, to be fair. So again, depending on, I suppose, your distance from the office and how long, and I say office, I should say nominal place of work, apologies. But if it's a case that you're away from your nominal place of work for a certain period of time, if it's 5 to 10 hours, the subsistence rate set out by revenue is €16.29, which basically means that if you're away at a conference, for example, if it's a conference that's going on for more than an hour, it's not a networking event, for example, it's something that you're going to be at all day, you can claim €16 worth of 29 worth of subsistence for any kind of, I suppose, food cost that you experience as a result of being away. If you're away for more than 10 hours, that actually increases to €39.08. So again, I'll make sure I can send across them details after today's, after today's Lunch and Learn webinar, and we'll make sure we share them with everyone too.
Yeah, we'll share the webinar via our website, Sean, and we'll copy the link, as you said, to your own site, you know,
Excellent.
Share with everyone of the attendees side. From Molly, will the length of my current contract affect what expense I can claim? So again, I would take that one kind of on a case by case basis, to be honest. If it's a case that you are coming to the end of your agreement and let's say your contract is ending in 2 weeks' time, if you go and try and process a €3,000 MacBook, there'll be questions asked essentially as to why you now require it 2 weeks before your contract end date. So if it's a case that you're going to go into a new contract opportunity, or if your contract is going to be extended, I would say you'll have much more
joy in terms of claiming that expense once your contract renewal comes through. Again, like I say, the reason I suppose we had the business expenses at the start of throughout your contract journey and when you should claim these expenses, business equipment like that should be claimed as early as possible from, I suppose, starting or towards your start date. It doesn't necessarily have to be after your start date. It can be before it. But if you're coming to the end of your agreement, if you're coming to the end of your contract, expenses like a €3,000 MacBook will raise questions. If it's stationary or if it's, I suppose, something smaller, it shouldn't raise any kind of eyebrows, to be honest.
Great. From Vincent, what charitable contributions or sponsorships are allowed?
So you are allowed to make charitable contributions. You are allowed to do sponsorships as well. Again, what I would say is to reach out to your accountant directly to just kind of get advice on that. It's something that we're actually, I suppose, doing in the very near future with regards to the relief available to Ukraine. So it's definitely considered an expense. It's definitely taken away from your corporation tax liability at the end of the day. So again, keep it in check. Don't I suppose go too far with it. But again, depending on where you're looking to donate and what you're looking to kind of do, if it's a sponsorship opportunity that's going to bring in new business, it may be, I suppose, more allowable than other expenses just as a once-off kind of contribution. So best advice I can give there, Tony, to be honest, is to reach out to your accountant directly on that one.
Yeah, and just ask the question. I have a question. From Gillian, and we might cover it on our next episode in this series, when you're moving from POE to umbrella or private limited. How soon can you claim those expenses from a private or umbrella limited side?
So in terms of, is it the cost of incorporating the company, Tony, or is it a case?
Yeah, coming across from a direct employee, I suppose, such as a POA worker, umbrella contractor,
Essentially, as soon as you have the offer, to be honest, as soon as you've accepted the offer. So like I say, obviously, typically in today's world, essentially, you've got kind of a 4-week notice period. That's not to say that you have to wait up till 10 days before your contract actually starts to go and buy your business equipment. As long as you keep the receipt. The biggest thing I would say is make sure you've got the company name on the receipt, obviously, and there'll be no problem with regards to backdating it, even up to 2 months, to be honest, with regards to your contract opportunity. The biggest thing would be a letter of offer or an acceptance, I suppose, of the actual contract role. And from that point, you'll have absolutely no issues in claiming the expense. Yeah,
we kind of merged the next few questions there from Kevin, Sean, Tony, and Jeff. On the electrical and the internet side, the usage, if you're, maybe 2 or 3 days from home, is there a set guide in terms of when you can start claiming the approx 50%? Do you have to prove any terms of usage or anything like that?
Not necessarily. Again, I suppose most contracts now will have, I suppose, the nature of the contract in it. So whether it's hybrid, whether it is a completely remote role, I would say that, again, 100% submit the expense. It should be a case that 50% of your usage can be allowable. And to go from there. If it's a case that your accountant has any queries or questions on it, they'll raise them with you. But at a very minimum, if it's a case where you can claim up to 50%, you'll definitely be entitled to your €3.20 per day on the 3 days where you are working fully remote from home.
Yeah, and just a couple of questions internally, Sean, but might as well ask them as they've come up. On the relocation side, you have 10-night stay allowance. If you're subcontracting in Ireland or going from site to site or maybe in a project role, can you charge that every, a couple of times a year is it just one relocation?
No, actually, it's something that can be claimed essentially as long as the relocation is more than, like I say, that 100 kilometers that's set out, you can claim it as many times. So if you're taking a 3-month contract role, for example, in Cork tomorrow, Tony, you can claim, obviously, me as a Wexford man, I can claim it obviously getting down to Cork. If I'm then going to be moved to Dublin to a different site, I can then claim it again when I'm heading back to Dublin, essentially as a new relocation expense. And likewise, if I was to travel west then after that contract opportunity, I can claim it again. The one thing I would say to you again is if it's a case that your role entails travel. So one that we come across quite often is with locum doctors. And unfortunately for locum doctors, it's considered part of their role. The travel essentially it's considered part of their role from hospital to hospital. And they aren't allowed to claim mileage between hospitals essentially. And that was something that Revenue were very strict on, I suppose, during the lockdown period even. So again, what I'd say is reach out to your advisor essentially just to make sure. But as long as the relocation is more than 100 kilometers, it's not limited to once a year. No, absolutely not.
Yeah, and just looking, just finally, people coming into the contracting world for the first time, you covered there in the quick tips, but a few questions. What would be your quick guide, straight away in terms of the expenses that you need to look at that you can maybe, claim straight away?
Straight away, I would say the equipment ones. Again, because obviously you need to be set up for your contract in the best possible way. So if your laptop is slow, or if you're using a laptop that's a couple of years old, go out and get yourself a new laptop. It will be a business expense, like I say, and it'll put you in the best position, obviously, for success at your new contract role. The other thing I would say is, again, the pension contributions and the income protection is to consider them at least. If you're not going to go ahead with them, at least understand that, I suppose, once it's done, it's done. So if you process payroll without the pension contribution, you can't get that money back from revenue. Whereas if you start off with a pension contribution from the very start, you're starting on the right path. And again, you'll have more money in your future pot. The only other one that I would think as well, again, is just to kind of keep in mind, you'd be surprised at 100 kilometers relocation. It's quite easy to travel 100 kilometers essentially. So you might be entitled to relocation expenses. So make sure you do a calculation, obviously, as well on that. And if you can claim them, definitely take advantage of it.
Great. Yeah. Finally, just to close, I think question from my side: how can we encourage the revenue to, look at maybe the golf course expenses? And I think you mentioned coppers. How do we change that, or is there anything we can do?
Rest assured that we're doing our best. We're doing our best to get them to open up a few more opportunities for us. But
there's a lot of deals on the golf course, or maybe restaurants and bars.
There is now. Listen, I don't get out to play half as much as I'd like to, Tony, but at the same time, I'd have no problem in saying that I'd be a strong believer that it should be something that's at least considered. Unfortunately, there hasn't been much movement on it in, I suppose, the last decade, and I can't see it changing if I'm going to give an honest answer. But we will keep pushing up. We'll keep trying our best to make sure that the contractor community is looked after from that point of view.
That's great. Thanks, Sean. Listen, that completes our Q&A session. Listen, thanks for all the attendees today. I think it was a positive attendance list. I know we had a good weather, so we were kind of worried that maybe people would utilize the sun in their lunch, but I think it's a great kickoff to Berkeley's Lunch and Learn series in association with Icon. If you can log into our website, we have 3 further episodes in the coming weeks. Thursday, April the 7th, right time to move to contracting, will be an interesting session again with Icon. Following that, we'll have our entrepreneurial relief episode on Thursday, April the 14th. And we'll complete this series with the making the switch. And when you make the switch, I think we discussed it in one of the questions, from POA to umbrella, or indeed even umbrella to private limited company. So thanks again, Sean. Very enlightening. Again, everything will be shared on our website from this webinar, and feel free to reach out to myself or Sean if you have any further questions from today's session. And I would encourage you also to reach out to Icon and indeed our consultants in Berkeley. Please join our website, and every attachment and every episode here in this series will be linked. And thanks again.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.